But did you ever intend in the very beginning in 1963 that your writing would cause a revolution?
Welcome to the kind of woman power that sustained our grandmothers for 72 years in their struggle to get the right to vote. Welcome to the new wave of feminism. Welcome to each other. Welcome home.
The 1960s are a time remembered greatly for societal growth and rebirth. In the midst of the Vietnam War, anti-war protests, and political assassinations, a monumental concept emerged and the sexual revolution began. The sexual revolution was a time of liberation and breakthroughs for women across the United States in the 1960s. Women prior to the revolution were treated as sexual objects and servants to men. They were not able to freely explore themselves sexually due to criticism from the opposite gender because they were seen as unrespectable and unpure. This incredibly divided society because women across the United States believed they had the same needs sexually as men, and men across the US saw that women should not be allowed sexual freedom because it is unholy and, in their opinion, gross. Betty Friedan, an American feminist, writer, and author, was able to compile the pain and exhaust of the housewives and put it together in her book, The Feminine Mystique. The book stirred up an exquisite audience who did not close off their feelings and began to stand up for themselves and their households. This was truly the start of the revolution. The sexual revolution of the 1960s is a frontier in history because of its new and monumental ideas for women. The revolution brought on protests and rebellions against unfair sexual division amongst men and women, which ultimately led to the breakthrough of that barrier. Women prior to the 1960s, specifically those married to wealthy men, were unquestionably placed under the American housewife tier. This meant they were subject to the housewife ideals. This includes, but is not limited to, servitude to their husbands, not having a professional job, but rather a stay-at-home mom, cooking, cleaning, and more. To many women outside of the States, this seemed like the ideal life, and comparing it to theirs on a moral compass is true. So why were American housewives miserable? What it really boils down to is the feeling of being constantly monitored and controlled by men. There was no sense of freedom for the housewife. Women were never able to explore the sexual world before marriage. This was a major reason the sexual revolution began. Men were seen as the ones who were able to go out and have sexual freedom, but oftentimes women were seen as lowlives with no control or mortality. Feminists in the 1960s asserted that most, if not all, single women enjoyed sex and had sexual needs just like men. They rallied that sex was a part of life. When the oral contraceptive pill for women was legalized in 1960, it made it a lot easier and safer for women to freely have sex. Women did not have to be worried about carrying and then caring for a child with no father, and it allowed them to be explorative sexually just like men. Betty Naomi Goldstein was born on February 4, 1921 in Perugia, Illinois, the oldest of 3 children, to her father Harry Goldstein, who was a Russian immigrant, and mother Miriam Horowitz Goldstein, a Hungarian immigrant. Her father worked his life as a jeweler, and her mother worked as a journalist until Betty was born. Betty followed her mom's footsteps as a journalist, working for many posts such as Federated Press, UE News, the media organ for the United Electric, and Machine Workers of America. She didn't immediately get into the industry, first attending Smith College with her graduating class of 1942, where she became a psychology graduate. As World War I raged on, Friedan showed interest in a number of different political causes, opening her palette in journalism. In 1947, she married Carl Friedan, a theater producer, and they had 3 children. They moved from Queens, New York to suburban Rockland County, where Friedan became a housewife, providing some income to the family by freelance writing for women's magazines. In the late 1950s, Friedan began her research on what would later become the feminine mystique by surveying her classmates at their 15-year reunion. Here she found that most women were just as dissatisfied as she was in the limited world of suburban housewives. She continued her research for the next 5 years, charting women's metamorphosis from the career-minded women of the 1920s to the housewives of the post-war era who were expected to find total fulfillment as wives and mothers. Published in 1963, The Feminine Mystique became an instant bestseller. Even in today's standards, it is dubbed as one of the most influential works of the 20th century. It quickly propelled Friedan into leadership. The feminine mystique was the idolized image to which women tried to conform to despite their lack of fulfillment. She explains that in post-World War II U.S. life, women were encouraged to be wives, mothers, and housewives. She explains how placing women into this confined construct prevented women from success and happiness, which consequently affected their families. The first sentences of her book resonate with women of our decade just as much as those in the 60s. She states, "The problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the 20th century in the United States. Her powerful words appealed to many women who were unhappy in their so-called idyllic life, addressing the disconnect with the ingrained sexism in society and how many people were unfazed by it." The book itself, however, did adhere to a specific audience and failed to recognize the circumstances of other women. LGBTQ and Black citizens associated in the movement were largely absent from the pages of The Feminine Mystique. Prominent members of the feminist movement would come to clash with her beliefs and quick temper. Her contributions, however, remained influential to the coming era. Friedan's book triggered an awareness amongst women that things needed to change, and it sold over 1 million copies. Clearly, the book is heavily based on housewives and the workforce. However, it is honestly seen as what started the new wave of feminism, and it made it easier for women to speak about the discriminative ideals in America, like sexual needs. Betty's book made women feel secure in standing up against unfair gender treatment.
We want to have some control over the decisions that affect our lives.
All right, will you please sit down or be removed from the
No, we aren't going to sit
chamber?
down. Why don't you give us some solid answers to our questions? You're going to take women, you're going to drag women.
When Betty wrote The Feminine Mystique, many stated that she had brought critical understanding to a quote-unquote problem that had no name. Many women felt they were too inferior to men to be able to discuss their attitudes toward being a superficial housewife, and therefore The Feminine Mystique discussed problems not many had sought to introduce to society. The question, how could someone write a book addressing a problem that has no name, arose, and Betty was not only able to prove it possible, but also imperative. In 1966, Friedan joined forces with Polly Murray and Aileen Hernandez to found the National Organization for Women, which remains a leading feminist organization, with Friedan as its first president. She also founded NOW's mission statement to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society, now exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. Friedan was behind many of the feminist movements, societies, and organizations such as the National Women's Political Caucus and the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, now known as NARAL Pro-Choice America. Eventually, as more diverse voices emerged in feminism, Friedan could no longer retain her leadership and was criticized by other feminists for focusing on issues facing primarily white, middle-class, educated, heterosexual women. She began to become alienated from her younger radical feminists. Nonetheless, Friedan remained a visible, important advocate for women's rights. Her incredible work in the feminist movement truly was the framework for the sexual revolution. Her book, reaching many audiences, made women feel less alone in their own thoughts of being a housewife. Her book challenged traditional roles of women, their jobs, sex life, treatment at home, abortion laws, and much more. Friedan stated in an interview with PBS, "It was quite fantastic, the effect it had. It had put into words what a lot of women had been feeling and thinking. A lot of people today believe that a feminist sexual revolution would have occurred without the publication of The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and while that is most likely true, it nevertheless impacted the lives of hundreds of thousands of women." After the works of Betty Friedan, it is evident why the sexual revolution was able to start and how women were able to break free of the sexual barriers. The Feminine Mystique, 1963. As she made her bed, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, "Is this all?"